So we will continue our day of medals with a presentation by Patrick McMahon. He is the Director of Exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts, but he's also a medal collector, and he is the MFA's go-to guy for medals in their collection. And Patrick is going to talk about Victor David Brenner's early works, which should be a lot of fun. I put out a couple of our Brenners for you, and I hope they wind up in your talk. So,
thanks, Anne. So as Anne said, I'm not a curator at the museum. I am Director of Exhibitions, and I'm trying to run this presentation sort of like we would want to do an exhibition, which is to show more than tell, and get you to sort of look with me and think a little bit about it. And I think there's some strangeness to Brenner's early work, and the usual story is that he worked for Robert Stoll making commercial badges or medals and did a random assortment of side projects whenever he could while he attended night school, and eventually he saves enough money to go to Paris and study with Roti. But you can find lots of other stories that don't fit this narrative very easily, like the work he does for and with the ANS in the 1890s. And because of these stories, the diversity of the purpose and appearance of his early work raises interesting questions, and I think it's often misunderstood. To make sense of it, there's a tendency to try and group it by what it looks like and how it was made, and this doesn't work. And Glenn Smedley tried to do this to some extent with his attempt to catalog Brenner in the 1980s, and his first pair of photographic plates, which are on the screen right now, it's a mixture of early and late material. And Brenner is responsible for literally hundreds of medals. I think over 300 are cataloged on Dick Johnson's website. And the sheer number of them makes them collectible, which is great. Trying to understand them is a big part of the appeal in collecting them, I think. So I guess what I would ask is, as we go through, I'm trying to sort of figure out how does a young artist manage his career in New York while he's trying to become the artist that he wants to be. And so when we look at these things, think about the other person who's always present when you're looking at a work of art or something like that, which is the person who made it. Why is his work so diverse? Why do some of them look the way they do? What is the artist's intention? What's he looking at when he creates it? What are they for? What's the actual extent of his involvement? Because his involvement in some of these is questionable. And is he creating something new? So to begin to sort out any of this, you first have to know whether you're actually looking at Brenner's work or something else. And so I'm going to start with two problematic but prestigious athletic awards. Most athletic badges are cheaply made or entirely hand engraved, and these two that I'm going to talk about were notable in their day for being struck, and at least that's what they were called in the press as a way of distinguishing them from what people were used to. And here's one of them that is cataloged normally as Smedley number 2. This is a good example of a problem medal. It starts to appear with Brenner's signature on it in about 1894, and is one of the more popular and easily found works by Brenner from this period. And as I said, it's cataloged as Smedley number 2. So Smedley places it obviously very early in Brenner's career, which is correct. Here's one in silver, and it's signed in reverse at the bottom, which you can see under the baseball mitt, kind of over by the ice skate on the left, and then it says R. Stoll, maker, from there to the baseball bat. And then here's another one, and this would automatically also be called Smedley 2, except it would perhaps be described as an unsigned work by Brenner or a work after Brenner's style, something like that. You see it all the time, except for what it is inscribed in the back. And this particular object was awarded in Detroit on September 19th in 1888, which is actually the first national meet for the Amateur Athletic Association. And this is almost 2 years before Brenner comes to the U.S. He obviously had nothing to do with the design of this medal. When he does get his turn, it's already a well-known medal. It's a prestigious competition. They held them all over the country, and his job, when I guess asked to create this reverse die, was to copy what it looked like, and he does a good job. But he's not really bringing anything else to this. And I'm not convinced that he actually is responsible for the appearance of the obverse, even on the ones that have his signature on the reverse, because he usually signs almost everything he does. And if he had an opportunity to do the obverse, I don't understand why it wouldn't be signed, since he was clearly permitted to sign the reverse. I also think that this object is a bit weird in the iconography. I'm not sure if that, it's an athletic medal, so she's supposed to be Victory, presumably, but she seems to be riding some kind of a wheel. sort of abstract thing that, you'd maybe find that in Fortune, and that's a weird message for a competitive award to say, congratulations, you got lucky. So I think this one's kind of a mess. But what I think is going on is because there are other things that look like it that are coming perhaps from some third source, and whoever the engravers are, they're copying it and then modifying it to what they're doing. And a good example is this one here, which is a life-saving medal from 1889, still before Brenner comes to the U.S. This is called the Danmark Medal, and it's awarded to the crew of the SS Missouri, I think, for rescuing the crew of the Danmark, and this happens in 1889, and the medal is awarded in Philadelphia. But you can see it makes a little more sense, the iconography in this case, because it's a ship's wheel at the bottom, and she has wings, so it doesn't make it look like she's riding the wheel. And so I think there's patterns and sources and things that are being copied by a lot of these commercial engravers, not necessarily objects of their own design. Now here's another one that's somewhat problematic, and this is, I'm going to have to read it because it's a mouthful. It's the Intercollegiate Association of Amateur Athletes of America. It's known generally as the IC4A for that reason. And I know that's not what it says on there, but that is what the organization is called. And this example is signed at the base of the central figure, which is a representation of the classical sculpture known as the Borghese Gladiator. The meet was an annual event akin to a national championship, and the award only looked like this in the 1890s. They're much harder to find than the AAU medal, and this one is marked on the reverse as well as being awarded in 1896, and Brenner's signature appears on the reverse as well, which is just a plain wreath. This is not the version of this medal that you're most likely to encounter, however. This one is. This version is slightly smaller in size. This one's awarded in 1891, and it's signed at the base of the Gladiator by Barber, who's the chief engraver of the U.S. Mint. So clearly, just because you're engraving athletic badges doesn't mean that you're some sort of toiling factory worker, but that's often how Brenner is perceived because of these works. This was an elite competition, and when they started out to award medals to individual athletes in 1890, they may have wanted a prestigious engraver to cut the dies. And even though Barber's die seems to have been used in more years of the competition, it's Brenner that is suggested as the author of the unsigned ones when they turn up. Like this one on the right, very unfortunately. It was listed as possibly a work by Victor David Brenner on eBay, but it is clearly a poorly done copy of the die cut by Barber. Wisely, it is not signed. This one was awarded in 1899. They look the same in size on the slide, but Brenner's die is larger and has a longer inscription going around the perimeter. You can see they shortened it even more on the smaller one. And this might be because 1896 was the 20th anniversary of the event. But whatever the reason, it gave him a chance to show his ability in comparison to Barber's, only to have the effect diluted by speculative attributions for the grubbier ones, like the one you see on the right. And this is surely because of Glenn Smedley, and not to blame him, it's unintended consequence, but his book, which I showed the plate from, has just these tiny little thumbnail images, and that's really one of the only locatable resources someone can find if they're collecting these things and they want to look up what it is. So you see this tiny picture of the Borghese Gladiator, it says Brenner, and these things turn up as unsigned works by Brenner. So if Brenner's not just a toiling factory worker, what is he? He's an artist, he's a professional engraver, and he's in business for himself. And on the top, you can barely see it, but it's a business card that says D. Brenner, die sinker and medalleur, 61 Nassau Street. And on Nassau Street, he actually worked with his father and his brother Morris. They're listed in the directory as G. Brenner and Sons, but also separately under their own names at the same address. And then at around 1894, he changes his name from David Brenner to Victor David Brenner, and he starts advertising in the I want to say numismatic circular. It's the Jeweler's Circular and Orological Review. And he takes a different address, which is this Downing Street building that you can see on the right. It's 108 Fulton Street, room 1108, so he's probably on the 11th floor, which puts him up at the top, or near the middle. Here are two examples of the Jeweler's Circular, so you can see the kinds of things that Brenner is looking at. This is a weekly publication. The one on the left shows Maiden Lane, a view of Maiden Lane, which is a jewelry district in Manhattan, very near where Brenner has his building. And on the right, you can see a plate taken from the Magazine of Art, and it's medals of Jules Chaplin. And so clearly, Brenner is aware of this stuff very early, and he's advertising himself as a medalleur in this journal. And this starts in about 1894, as I said, but also in 1894, what he does is he joins the ANS. And this is a kind of a big moment for him. In the November 19th, I think, minutes of the meeting for the ANS, they note that Victor David Brenner has become a member, but they also note that Samuel Putnam Avery, who you see on the right, is displaying a collection of medals by Oscar Roti at the Society. And Avery is one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's a big collector. He's also an artist in his own right. And he's getting these things from his agent in Paris, a man named George Lucas. And as he is pulling all of this contemporary French art into the States, he's giving it to the Met. And this is a notice in the Jeweler's Circular that collection of Roti medals that Avery was showing several years earlier at the ANS is being given to the Met. This is a pretty cool combination of things, that one note, because the ANS and Avery and Roti are going to be the three sort of main catalysts of Brenner's career, basically from here, and it's all right there in that one moment noted in the minutes of the meeting. The first time Brenner actually appears in the circular isn't an advertisement at all. It's 1894, and it's an editorial about his well-known football medal. But what this tells us that is, I think, not published anywhere else, is that he's basing it on a football match, that it was a painting by a couple of artists named Overend and Smythe. And that painting was sort of a sensation in 1889 at the World's Fair, and it is promoted constantly by prints that reproduce it. So it was, there are two kinds of the print. There's a British version and an American version, but the subject of the medal is actually a rugby match between England and Scotland that ended in a 0-0 tie. And here you can see one of the lithographs, color lithographs, and Brenner's die, which is very, very small. It's a very small medal, and he's engraved it entirely by hand, and that's part of what the article is about, is how you need a magnifying glass to look at it, but all the figures are there, and you can see he is looking at this print or another one, but he's clearly reproducing this object, and you know, he's doing this for himself in the hope that he's going to find a public market. He's trying to be entrepreneurial. It could be used as a award for a football game or commemoration of one, but it could also just be collected and enjoyed like a print. His advertisements tend to look like this, and sometimes they show things that are not in any of the literature, which is exciting. Other times they are well-known objects, like the one on the right, where you see in the middle of the page, Dies and Medals, Victor D. Brenner. That's the Church of the Holy Redeemer Jubilee medal. That one's well-known. But on the left, those were new to me when I first saw them, and it took a while to figure out that the object on the top basically says Empire State and Sons of the American Revolution. And it's a Minuteman and a plow, which is their logo. With the knob at the top, I suppose it's a badge, I've not located one of these, but clearly they existed. And then the one at the bottom was a little more confusing, but you already know what it is if you remember Anne's slide from earlier, if you've been upstairs. This is the California Midwinter International Exposition, and here's Brenner basically advertising it as his own work. This is published everywhere, known to be by someone named A. Giacomi, because there's a listing at of the awards in the fair that say that A. Giacomi won an award for best design for a medal. And it's entirely possible that Giacomi designs this medal and that Brenner has simply engraved it, because as we've already seen, the designer and the engraver are not often the same person. And then we have two little vignettes at the bottom. One's clearly Ulysses Grant. I don't know who the other one's supposed to be, but as you can see from his listing, he does all kinds of things besides just medals. And in this case, he's produced a die for a badge that was made by Braxmar. And Braxmar is on Maiden Lane, and they do the badges for police and fire and everything like that. And in this particular case, the fair organizers were keen to make sure that the winners got their badges, got their awards before the fair was over. That didn't happen in Chicago, and they're trying to show up their peers. This is a year later. They're doing the fair in the middle of the winter. It's a very competitive thing. So they get these badges. They're all the same. They all tend to be really thickly covered with a varnish, so it's hard to tell if the Brenner's signature might be tucked away somewhere. But you had a choice. You got a certificate that said if you were a gold medal or silver winner, and you had a choice to upgrade it at your own expense, either by gold filling it or silver plating it. And I've seen a bunch of these, but I've never seen an upgraded one until today, and Anne was very kind to put both of the MHS's specimens on view. In 1896, in June, Brenner gets a piece actually on the cover of that week's Jeweler's Circular, and it's an article about his Chauncey Depew medal. Depew was the president of the New York Central Railroad and a celebrated orator, and whether for the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty or for a dinner party, he was constantly giving speeches. Volumes of his speeches have been published, and the article shown here suggests that Brenner uses his die to strike, quote, souvenirs for mementos of occasions rendered memorable through the participation of Dr. Depew. Sounds like it was written by Chauncey Depew. And in the 19th century with these trade journals, the editorial content could be written by Brenner. It could be an advertisement. You can't really tell the difference. And this is a great medal, though, and you can really see Brenner trying to experiment with it. One strange feature about it is it has no rim. It's also got a very, very high relief figure with Mercury on the reverse, and beside him is the Muse of Eloquence, and behind the both of them is a train billowing with smoke that vaguely forms the figure of Columbia in very low relief. And if you look at it in a raking light, you can see just how extreme this is. It even curves off at the bottom, as you see on the right-hand side, but there's no rim, and Mercury is quite prominent, and you can barely see the smoke. And this tells me that he is interested in French metals. He's looking at what the French are doing. He's just trying to do it the hard way. He's engraving it by hand, and it's not as effective as when you're able to sculpt it on a tablet and then use a reducing machine the way the French do. The idea that you might use this to commemorate dinners with Chauncey Depew sounds pretty silly, but it's actually plausible because when you find them, they vary quite a bit. The one on the left is in the ANS. It's the one that Brenner gave them, and it's punched on the shoulder, V.D. Brenner, Fekete, NY. You also see in a different medal this sort of splotchy-looking one without a signature at all or anything on the obverse. And then there are these sort of chocolatey, almost black ones like you see on the right, which say V.D. Brenner, NY, without the Fekete. And you can see the shoulder sort of down towards about 6 o'clock also looks like it's been reworked a bit, like maybe there was one that had an inscription or something on the die and then it got polished off. So they all kind of vary, and usually the listings, when you find sales on them, don't talk about this, so it's hard to tell how many there are of each different kind. They also come in white metal, and so this is one of my favorite pieces of Brenner's from this period. This is also around the time that he gets a commission for his first ANS medal, which Scott Miller writes about in his book, and I'm just trying to show here that this is actually a very important medal for Brenner because it turns out to be his ticket to Paris, and clearly he's looking at either a photograph or this engraving after a photograph of William Augustus Muhlenberg. The ANS commissioned this medal for the opening of the new St. Luke's Hospital, which he was affiliated with the original one, and Brenner quickly starts to use it in his own advertising. But there's a story later on, years later in the newspaper, there's an article that cites Samuel Putnam Avery saying that he was so struck by this medal and the photographic quality of the likeness that he basically decides to help Brenner get to Paris. At the same time, he's doing other things. You can see here's an advertisement from '97 of a plaque, also clearly taking a form that's happening with French medals. And he's doing a portrait of Fridtjof Nansen, the famous explorer. Nansen's coming to New York to receive the Column Geographical Society medal, and Brenner is trying to create something that he thinks will have some popular appeal during that event. And then he's advertising it. What kills me is down on the bottom of the ad it says "Send for Circular." I would love to get a hold of Brenner's Circular and see how else he was, what else he was selling and how he was doing it. But he knows very, very well about the Column Geographical Society medal because he's engraving it. And he's doing it for an eminent artist of the period, a woman named Lydia Field Emmett. This is her portrait on the left, done by William Merritt Chase in 1892 when she was decorating the Women's Building at the Chicago World's Fair. This is her medal for Fridtjof Nansen from the Column Geographical Society. And their signatures are both on the bottom with their initials, with him as the sculptor and her, or him as the engraver and her as the designer. At the same time, he's still doing these kind of cheaply made badges for Robert Stoll. So the idea that somehow these are earlier than what you just saw is not true. This one on the left, the Photographers Association of Michigan, they only existed in 96, 97, and 98 before they were taken over by the national organization. And the New England Intercollegiate Athletic Association on the right, also probably, it was noted on the back it was awarded in 97, but it probably dates to, it could have been made in, the die could have been made in 96. But, so these basically bridge the same period of time that you just saw between the Muhlenberg medal and the Emmett's medal. The last medal Brenner will do before he leaves for Paris is his well-known Charities and Corrections medal. And this one comes out in '98, and it's a very beautiful medal, but you can see as he's hand engraving things like drapery and things like that, he's still having trouble. I mean, it almost looks like she's wearing armor or something. It doesn't really look like convincing drapery, and luckily, as the story goes, this is supposedly the last medal that he engraves by hand. After he goes to Paris, he learns how to model and use a reducing machine. When he goes, his story gets picked up in a couple of places. That's the Jeweler's Circular on the right, talking about the medal that he's just made, and on the left, there's an article by a man named Charles Caffin showing the pieces that were on my prior slide. There's the Nansen medal and then the Column Geographical Society. Caffin actually does talk about Brenner's early biography, about how he leaves Russia and attributes his interest in this little biographical paragraph in medals to having visited the Met after he came to New York. So he's basically saying the Metropolitan Museum of Art had influenced Brenner's decision to become a medalleur. And Caffin, ironically, is going to write about Brenner again, and he eventually is the source of the myth that Brenner once sold matches on Fulton Street to get by, but I think it's a typo, because it takes a piece of flip type to turn a watch seller into a match seller, and Brenner was definitely a watch seller as well. So this is a big moment for him. He's leaving for Paris to learn what he wants to learn. He's interested in studying with Roti, but it's also a really big moment for Roti. This is Oscar Roti's most celebrated medal, I think, and it's a masterpiece. It's commemorating the assassination of Sadi Carnot, the president of France. That happened in 1894, but I don't believe the medal actually is issued to the public until 1898. So Brenner's arriving in Paris while Roti's at his peak fame. And when you can see two things Roti's well known for. One is the changing of the form, bringing back some of these plaquette forms. And the other is how well he does drapery, and that's what I think, for me, makes this a masterpiece. Trying to show something while concealing it is no easy trick. And if you look at the body of the dead president, you can see his chest and his arm very clearly, and especially the figures carrying the coffin on the right. They're carrying him to the Pantheon, and there's not any. The only human flesh that you can see in that is the heel on the figure at the bottom left there. All of the rest of the bodies are covered, every inch of them, but yet you can see the shoulders, the back, the hips. It's all very easily readable, and to be able to do that requires great talent. When Brenner arrives in Paris, he goes straight to the door of a man named George Lucas, who I mentioned earlier is the agent for Samuel Putnam Avery. And Lucas is basically shown here in a portrait that he had done of himself by an artist whose name is Moreau-Vautier, and he had himself done by Moreau-Vautier, and then he sent it to the Met and gave it to the Met, and has been at the Met the entire time Brenner's in New York, so perhaps he even knew this particular portrait before he gets there. But when he gets there and he meets Lucas, he has a letter of reference from Avery, and Lucas goes almost immediately, within a 2 weeks period, he goes to the Mint to talk about Brenner, and then he goes and visits Roti and to talk about Brenner, and then nothing happens. So they must have said no. At the same time, I should mention that one of the remarkable things about Lucas is that he keeps a diary of everything that he does, letters that he sends, everywhere he goes, what he eats, when he visits the dentist. It's kind of crazy, but it's an amazing resource. And he does this from 1857, when he moves to Paris, all the way up until his death in around 1909. And it's where I'm getting this information. So he visits those places, nothing happens, and he's at the same time trying to get a copy of this bust made from the plaster by the son-in-law of the artist. And he often talks about Ernest Dagenet and Brenner in the same diary entries. And he, at one point, lists Brenner's name next to the address 103 Rue Vaugirard. And I don't know if it's for an appointment or if it's just Brenner's new work address. But that actually is already in Lucas's diary as the address of Clovis Delacour, who is an ivory carver. And obviously, Brenner gets to know him. And so I think they're all part of the same circle. And there's an example of Delacour's work on the left. It's an ivory Diana. And Delacour is also a member of the Royal Academy, and he's in London a lot. So he may have lent the studio to Brenner while he's in Paris, or they may have just been there. But if Brenner was there, he would have seen the plaster, or at least knew from Lucas what he was trying to have his portrait redone, and whether or not Lucas actually told him to make his. Brenner's doing a portrait of Lucas as well, and if Lucas told him to make it look like the other one or not, it's hard to tell, but that is exactly what he gets. So this is a side view of the Moreau-Vautier portrait, and then there's the portrait that Brenner does for Lucas, and Lucas is quite pleased with it, and so he starts giving Brenner commissions, small things while they're waiting. And this remarkable thing is a book of a Grolier book on the museum, the Plantin Moretus Museum, which is a museum of a publishing family that goes back quite a ways. And in the diary, he says he's lending the book to Brenner to figure out how he might want to encrust it. And he certainly has encrusted it. It looks like he's encrusted it with badges like the ones he was making when he was in New York. It also kind of looks like maybe the book Harry Potter got in trouble for sneaking into Hogwarts to read. It's an amazing thing, and I'm grateful to a colleague at the Walters Art Museum for bringing it out and photographing it for me. Her name is Joanna Goldman, and apparently this has never been photographed before. So the only people who have seen this before today are other than ourselves, are people who've actually seen it in person. He's given another task, which is to do medallions for another book for Henry Walters, and that one's a little better known. That's this book, and it's often mislabeled, though. The book has an unfortunate title. It's just called Notes Critical and Biographical. It's the Walters collection, and it has autographed letters tipped in, and Brenner is making medallions for it by copying images from Walters' Chinese porcelain catalog. So this is it's often written that Brenner did medallions for the Chinese porcelain catalog, but he actually is basing them on the Chinese porcelain. And here's another example. This is taken right from the actual catalog, and you can see Brenner's modeling now, and instead of directly engraving, the low relief compares more favorably than what he was trying to do with the Depew metal. The other one's kind of fun too. It's branches and peonies, and obviously Brenner didn't quite like the way it looked, so he changes the orientation a little bit, and he changes the branches and so forth. And this book gets bound and ends up in Walter's library as well. But he still hasn't met Oscar Roti, and he's been in Paris for 9 months. And in his diary, Lucas writes on March 10th that he goes to the Mint. And this time, he and Brenner Brenner does come with him, goes in, and they spend 2 hours there. The next day, he goes to Roti, and this is March 11th, 1899, and in his diary, he says he goes there to talk about Brenner. And then at the end of that diary entry, he sends a note to Brenner saying that Roti will see him the next day from 12 to 12:10. So he waits 9 months to see the great man, and he's going to get a 10-minute appointment. I mean, that's like no pressure, right? Obviously, he uses the 10 minutes very well, because the rest is history. They become very good friends, and Brenner will work in his studio for the remainder of his time in Paris. And before he goes home in 1901, and he comes back 2 years later, and he spends several more years with Roti. But it clearly took some effort for them to even meet. And once he's in the studio and he starts working, the World's Fair comes in 1900, and Brenner has several jobs there. One includes the honor of producing the commemorative badge for the U.S. delegation, and here you can see his work heavily influenced by Roti already. There's that low relief sort of sketchy building in the background, which is the U.S. Pavilion. You can see it mirrored in the postcard on the left. And then you have the two allegorical figures, and you can see he's come a long way with his drapery. He's also won an honorable mention at the Salon, and he wins a bronze medal for his Clovis Delacour portrait, his portrait of George Lucas and one other at the World's Fair, which is all pretty good. But the other job he has is he's managing an exhibition for the ANS. They've sent an exhibition of the entire history of US coinage and a case full of badges of hereditary societies relative to the US. Perhaps even included the Sons of the American Revolution badge that Brenner himself made. But in the minutes of their meetings, they are asking St. Gaudens, who's there, and Brenner, and a man named Kuntz, who's the chief gemologist and vice president of Tiffany, to manage the exhibition for them. And Brenner does get a note of thanks in the journal afterwards. And I was going to take a quick peek ahead to what his work looks like after he gets home, and in honor of Veterans Day. This is his medal for the veterans of the Spanish-American War, issued by the state of Michigan on the left, and you can see that it strongly resembles an early work by Roti from 1884, a social insurance medal that has been issued pretty much continuously since, I think, 1884. And then, to end, I want to show you these are the original Galvanos of that medal that he does for the U.S. delegation at the World's Fair. And he has to do something for George Lucas before he goes home, and what he does is he inscribes these to Lucas and gives them to him as a gift. It's a pretty nice gift. But here you can really see how Brenner's work has changed. And once his work starts to look like this, we're not talking about the early work of Victor David Brenner anymore. And since I'm talking about the early work of Victor David Brenner, I'm going to have to stop. But this, again, I have to thank a colleague at the Walters. She took these pictures with her phone. I don't think these have ever been photographed, and they made their way to the Walters sometime in the 1950s. That's mine.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize.
That's okay. So we know his portrait of Augustus St. Gaudens. Was there a relationship there that was important?
Actually, their relationship is a bit of a mystery, but they definitely had one. Brenner was actually a student of St. Gaudens at the Art Student League in his early years in Manhattan, so they certainly knew each other then, and they're certainly together in Paris at this point. I only found St. Gaudens mentioned 2 times in the diary for George Lucas, so he doesn't end up really engaged with him very much. There's a mention 2 different days of Lucas dining out with St. Gaudens and his wife, but I don't know. I haven't seen any correspondence. It's unfortunate because Brenner's correspondences are sort of dispersed. And there's a bunch at the ANS in his brother Michael's papers, and there's some in the Archives of American Art and other places, some at the ANS. But St. Gaudens' papers were all burned in a studio fire. So there's not very many places you can look to hope to find them talking to each other. Is that? Neil?
Patrick, I'm sorry, you may have said, but I didn't hear. When did he return from Paris the second time?
He returns to Paris in 1903 and stays until 1907, something like that. Six or 7.
Okay, so about 4 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Whistler plaque that Anne has on view upstairs, he did that during his second trip, when he's actually borrowing. It's interesting. The later years with Lucas, he's borrowing sculpture from him. The John Paul Jones, he does that at this time. Lucas is a big collector of Antoine Louis Barry's animal sculptures, and Brenner borrows horses and things like that from him and returns them while he's working on these pieces. So presumably that's what he's looking at while he does the parade and things like that. But Lucas's diary is a great resource. Yeah? Thanks.